May I have a resolution to suspend Robert's Rules of Order?
So moved.
Second.
Will you take the call?
Yeah, just to note that this is a suspension just for the work session
Yeah.
portion of this
Yeah,
meeting.
sorry.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Lieband,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes, so we're going to move into our work session now.
If we could have our other team members come up and join us at the table. All right, and then Nicole, I know you have some scenarios. We've been working as a team since the levy failure in November on two different routes. One is, in what ways are we able to make some reductions through austerity measures, through tightening the belt? And then obviously looking at what does our revenue look like moving forward. So both of those things are happening at the same time. Just a reminder that we are on a somewhat challenging timeline when it comes to the revenue side of that. So the election was November 5th. We had multiple holidays in there, and then the filing deadline that we would need the board to take action on two different resolutions for Nicole to be able to file that in time is February 5th. So with that, we're on a pretty tight timeline. If the board would like to be, as we've discussed previously, on the ballot in May, we do need to take some action tonight, as well as at our second January meeting on January 27th, for us to be able to get those things filed, for Nicole to do that. So just want to kind of remind the public of that as well, that we are looking at two things. So we have been working with our team. We shared at the last meeting, but we were able to reduce 4.8 million out of our budget for this year. Committed to making those reductions moving forward throughout the life of the forecast. And then we're also continuing to work with the team on some recommendations on other places where we can make some reductions. We're trying to do that primarily through staff attrition, when there are opportunities through retirements and other movement. Are there positions we cannot fill? Can we ask other people to pick up those responsibilities, et cetera? So we are continuing to work through that. I know Nicole has prepared some scenarios capturing the 4.8 million that we've already reduced out of the budgets, as well as some additional austerity measures that we think we can make moving forward, and then what that would look like with some potential ballot issues. So Nicole, do you want to kind of talk through those?
Sure. So what you have in front of you are three separate scenarios. And if you see the blue writing on each spreadsheet, so we have estimates with reductions with no additional levy, estimates with reductions with a 4.9 additional levy in 2025 collection 26, and then estimates with reductions with a 5.9 mil additional levy in 2025 collection 2026. So I just kind of want to go through each one, starting with the no additional levy. What this is our November forecast that has been updated since with the reductions that we saw in the budgets for the departments and buildings, the 4.8 million that Angie was referring to, and assuming that would be our new base projected going forward based on those with those reductions in place. We also have eliminated the permanent improvement transfer out in the forecast. So we were transferring $65,000 a year into the permanent improvement fund for turf replacement to build up a balance for turf replacement in the future. This eliminates that transfer. It also reduces the transfer out in the forecast for the food service fund negative balances. So the food service fund can't carry negative lunch debt, so we have to absorb that debt into the general fund. We've allocated $100,000 previously in the forecast year over year. That's coming in around 60 to 70,000, so we've reduced that down to 70,000 in these scenarios. In addition to that, we also have a target estimate for salaries and benefits reduction for personnel costs with tier 1 measures of $3 million, approximately $3 million. So that's what the target that we're looking at. And that, as we project out in the forecast, with cost avoidance in the future, the cumulative total savings when we're looking at 2030 is about a $17 million impact to the forecast, that final unreserved fund balance, which is what we're looking at. So just to talk through this a little bit, we have the total revenues for the forecast period, which goes through 29 currently. And then once we pass June 30th, we'll be coming back in November, and then 2030 will be added to that. So I just wanted to include that here for illustrative purposes. Total expenditures, and then our revenues over and under our expenses. And again, I just want to remind everybody this also, we've moved that $30 million back into the general fund. That's why it looks like we do not have deficit spending in the current year, but we are projected to deficit spend quite significantly this current year, fiscal year 2025 that we're in. And then you can see the year over year, the revenues over or under expenses going forward on that next line. And then our cash balance July 1, cash balance June 30. Our reservations, so we have a budget reserve of 0.5%, which is in statute for previous year's revenues as a budget reserve for things that might come up that we're not, we don't have planned, that sort of thing. And then also any outstanding purchase orders, we carry about $5 million at the end of the year in outstanding purchase orders that we have to reserve into the next year. And so you can see the unreserved fund balance in days. Our target for each year of the forecast is 90 days per board policy. And so you can see we fall below the 90 days, even with the reductions, without any additional levy in that last year of the forecast. And you can see what our target unreserved fund balance is based on that 90-day number. And then the deficit spending millage equivalent for each of those years. And that's just, if you look at that revenues over or under expenditures line, what millage would it take to make up that deficit spending as the years go forward for each year? And then I had been asked, so I just wanted to add for informational purposes, what our average cost per day is. So for fiscal year 2025, it's about it costs us about $634,000 a day to operate the district. And that is projected to be about $732,000 by the end of the forecast period, $733,000 if you round up. So if we go to the next projection, and again, I can't stress this enough, these are estimates based on what we know today. This also assumes that the state will continue to phase in the Fair School Funding Plan. There have been a lot of comments made by the Speaker of the House that that is not on his priority of things to do. So we will be going through a biennium budget in the spring. The state will let us know what the next 2 years will look like in state funding. Our property values will continue to impact any calculation for a state and local share, as we've discussed. As property values have increased, we look wealthier as a community to the state. So the state says that our community is responsible for more of the cost for education in our community. So the next, sorry to get off track there. So this one looks at a 4.9 mil additional levy based on the austerity measures that we have in place and the targeted tier 1 in personnel reductions. You can see where we fall with that. We will have additional conversations as we're coming into the middle to end of February. We'll be discussing next year's budgets with departments and buildings. And so there will be additional opportunities for conversations around savings and things like that. Just want to note that because we did ask them to make some decisions after we were well into the school year. So it was probably pretty difficult for them to be able to cut things once we had already started. And so you can see the outcome of what a 4.9 mil levy looks like. And then if you go to the next page, a 5.9 mil additional levy and what that looks like. And again, I added that 2030 for illustrative purposes as we're looking at that for next year. I will bring back a forecast for the board to consider at the March 17th meeting once we get through the budget process. We have an optional spring update window with the state through March 31st. So we'll be bringing that back to the board prior to the May update. that was a lot in a short amount of time. I apologize. So please let me know if you have any questions about that, or if anything wasn't clear.
I guess I know people can't see what you've given us, right? And but I think it's really telling that even with a levy of 4.9 or 5.9, that we still are running a deficit in 2026. And so I think that's important for our community to know. I think also reiterating your 90 days, right? The 90 days is really important because we can't sign contracts, right? If we don't.
So the ability for us to sign contracts is based on the cash balance. When we talk about an unreserved balance policy, it's what's responsible for an organization to have for operating in the future. And that's typically around 60 to 90 days. We worked with the finance committee to develop that policy, and that was what we put in place based on the size of our district. And again, we're spending, $634,000 a day.
Yeah.
I think an important thing I want to highlight, Nicole kind of mentioned this, but just to reiterate, she said this is based on the fair school funding formula continuing to be phased in. Even if it is phased in, we are projecting flat revenue for the majority of this forecast, which is pretty much unheard of, but is based on the information we have from the state right now. So I think that's really important to share. So we are doing what we need to do on our side to say, what can we do without? How can we tighten our belt? But it's really important to note that we do have a revenue challenge. And I just want to continue to reiterate that it's not normal that we would be seeing flat funding, but because we are looking at being cut from the state's share, it is making our overall funding projections flat. So just as we think about, operating a district just like you would operate your household, just the basic inflation, increases in utilities, et cetera, it's hard to have the same number of services and project the same revenue for 5 years. So that's kind of where the challenge is. And I just want to make sure we continue to keep that in the forefront, that we're going to continue to do what we need to try to reduce some things so that we can stay within that revenue. But when we're not projecting revenue growth because of where the state has our funding, that's very, very challenging as we look at just natural inflation across the board.
Can you remind us, Ms. Marshall, I think it's about $4 million per mill, 4 point something?
Yeah, it's about 4.2 million per mill that we generate
Okay,
based on our current values.
okay.
And should the board approve a resolution of necessity this evening, we would submit that to the county auditor, and the county auditor would actually certify what that amount is, what the total amount would be, and
Yeah.
the rates for it.
Right. I'm just doing some fast math up here. It could be terrible math. But at about 4.2 million, 4.9 additional levy, that's about 31 days of operating. So that's just another way to think about that. That's what we're asking for. It's like 1 month, right, of operating at the average. I'd use the 2026 number for average cost per day, 651,000. So if my math's right, Mr. Doran can check me on that. That's, when I look at 4.9 is what we had asked for before, so that's why I'm choosing that one to plug in. It's about a month.
And just to note that this doesn't include anything with the bond portion or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I know we've had some conversations previously, but is there any additional information that would be helpful for you or anything that our team could answer at this point? I know we've had a lot of conversations over the last couple months, but just trying to recapture some of those ideas, just to remind, especially if people are just tuning in for the first time, that we have had ongoing conversations about it. We have looked at these scenarios previously. The good news is Nicole was able to update them with some of the austerity measures we've had, which puts us in a little better situation. But as we shared, even with the reductions, you know, we're still looking at a revenue shortfall.
Yeah, I have a question about the unreserved fund balance in days. So, you know, we have in policy getting to 90, right? 90 days. So since not everyone can see this here on the estimates with 4.9 additional levy, the way, you know, this, all the caveats, right, this depends on state funding and so on, are that we could stay above that level if a 4.9 additional levy were to pass collecting in 2026 and beyond. We could stay above 90 days through 2029, and then it's showing in 2030, we go just under that to 64 days. But that's gonna move on to the 5-year. That 2030 is gonna move on to the 5-year, right? Relatively quickly here. So, I think, you know, again, a lot of things will change in the next 5 years. We know that's not actually where things will end up, but it does mean that we need to really think about that in the 5th year, you know, as the model shows, we're falling under the 90 days with a 4.9, but it's close, so it's 64 days, and we need to get to 90. This makes me feel like, you know, as we build austerity measures in, and buildings are really tightening down, and we're, you know, that's something we might be able to make up. Is that wildly inaccurate?
No, I think, and I appreciate you saying all the unknowns, because I know Nicole's emphasized multiple times, we have 2 biennium budgets that'll play into this forecast, but, you know, I feel the closer it is, the more reliable the data is as we get out into that 5th year and we continue to make austerity measures and evaluate how we're doing things, looking for efficiencies. I absolutely think that's doable.
Okay, thanks.
And that's what our board policy prompts us to do. As we're looking at the forecast, we update it twice a year. So we do our original in November, and then we have our spring update in May. And anytime we would submit a forecast where any year of the forecast falls below that 90 days, that prompts all of us to start having a conversation. It just makes sure that we're paying attention to that balance and planning based on that.
I always have more questions, if that's okay. So in the process of looking for austerity measures now, I mean, obviously, like you said, it's mid-year, so that's kind of tough to do. But can you just talk a little bit from a process point of view about sort of how that looked as a process, and then like how that might look moving forward, right? Taking that mindset on a little more.
Yep. So I think 2 big areas. One is we talked about the budgets. And so as we look at our supplies, and these would be more of our non-staffing costs. Like Nicole said, when we did that, we were already halfway into the year. So certain things had already been spent. But as we get into the budgeting process here, actually next month, we'll start that in February. We'll be meeting with all the departments and all the buildings, really trying to dial down and get to a little more critical needs based on what do we need to do. So what that looks like is there may be some nice to have things that we've done in the past that we just won't do. There may be some activities, some units, some different things that we've done just because, you know, people like them. They're a nice addition to our programming, but maybe not a necessity. So we'll be looking at what are those areas that we can eliminate. We're going to be constantly looking for efficiencies across the board. But then the big one is we are a service organization, and so the majority of our cost comes from staffing. So because we're a large organization, we have opportunities as people retire or leave the district to look at, do we have to fill that spot right now? So that'll be twofold. One, do we need it at all? Is it just nice to have, or do we absolutely need it? Is it mission critical? And then, can we absorb things in the short term for a while? Can we shift work around? Can we restructure? So, with all the positions that open, that's something that we're going to be looking at.
Okay.
So we already have some ideas and some things that we think we're able to do for next school year. And at this point, trying to look as much as possible at attrition in those moves. But how can we do things more efficiently? I think it's important to note that every position we have was added because there's a value that that position gives to our kids and our community. And so we don't take that lightly. We know that all positions have value, but because of where we are fiscally, just looking at, are there ways to do things differently?
Yeah, thank you. And this will be my last one for a little bit, I promise. So in the austerity measures that have been identified thus far, I just want to make sure I'm understanding that that amount is something we feel we can sustain, right? So this isn't a one-time.
Correct. So we'll have to constantly, so we're committed to the amount, but we know as our student needs change and district needs change, different mandates, et cetera, where that amount comes from may shift around. So, part of our job obviously is to continuously assess what the student needs are and what we're required to do. And then how we get there might look different.
Okay, thank you.
And you don't have to have questions for them, but I did ask the rest of our team to come up. So if we have any questions as we think about facilities or, teaching, learn, any of those aspects, they're available. So if there are any other questions we can
I do
answer.
actually have a question with regards to facilities, because the bond issue was part of what didn't pass in November. We will not be, at this time, looking to put the bond issue back on the ballot. So what is going to happen with those projects that would have received funding from the bond?
So in terms of that second phase of the facility master plan, all of those larger projects are put on hold. We will continue with our preventative maintenance programs and plans, our capital improvement plans. Those things will continue. So you'll still see HVAC projects, you'll still see roofing projects as the permanent improvement funds allow. But the large scale projects will just be on pause until we decide that we're ready for further conversation in the future. I think right now we need to focus on securing the funding for the everyday expenditures.
I think one of the things we talked about too is, so as we shift and take different things out of the permanent improvement money, we may see, for example, some of our parking lots are in really bad shape. We were able to do full replacements, so shifting back to more of the patchwork quilt fixes versus being able to do a full replacement. So just trying to stretch those dollars a little bit further and again, take care of what needs to be taken care of versus maybe where we would like some of those things to be. Safety will be a priority with the bond project, with the facility projects, I should say. So if there's something that is creating a safety issue, that would have priority over other types of projects that we might want to do with limited funds.
I can't remember the answer to this question. I'm wondering, I know at one point we talked about, voting, and we don't really have a say in where those voting places are, but we have two, right, in Mark Twain and Robert Frost, and they have open gyms. Is that still on the agenda for?
That is correct. So we do see that as a safety piece. For those buildings, they do still have open concept gyms. Those two locations do. So we are looking at a project this summer. Those projects will come to the board for approval at the time using permanent improvement funds, not general funds, and or potentially 2019 bond funds that may remain to complete those projects.
Just for anybody who may be watching this video later, can you explain the difference between the permanent improvement and the general fund?
take that.
Nicole, anybody?
Yes, so voters at several years ago approved permanent improvement levies. So we receive tax funds through a permanent improvement levy that goes specifically into a separate fund outside of the general operating fund. And those funds are restricted specifically for things that are permanent improvements. So something that lasts longer than a 5-year useful life and those sorts of things. So you'll see a lot of facilities work with them and that sort of thing. There's also the ability to pay for technology with some of those funds.
School buses, we pay
yeah,
for.
School
buses,
buses and.
Our My
So it's a completely
Vans.
different like pot of money specifically for things that will outlive, the 5 years. They're not consumables, they're not for salaries. Yeah,
Correct,
Okay.
yes. And it is outside of the general fund.
yeah. Thank you.
Ms. Hamburger, maybe Mr. Reeves, I'm just hoping you could talk for a minute about like my goal, and I know I don't usually speak for everyone, but I think everyone probably feels this way, is to have the least impact on kids' learning, right? So in the austerity measures that you all have been discussing, especially, that might impact sort of the teaching and learning side of the house, is there anything that you feel will have a big impact on student experience, or are we really, I'm just looking for reassurance that we're really trying to make the least impact on kids and their learning? Is that, it's really broad, but I just feel like we need to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. I think we're looking at things like, are we able to absorb through attrition, general education positions where maybe we're still good class sizes, but maybe we're able to offer a class 3 periods instead of 4, for example. So we're looking for those types of efficiencies versus we're cutting programs.
Yep.
I think is what you're getting at. So,
Sure, yeah.
certainly as we look at what would our recommendations be if we're not able to secure additional funding, we would start looking at programming. But at this level 1, we're really trying to look at, are we able to make adjustments within a schedule at a high school level, for example, where we're still offering classes, but maybe they're larger class sizes, especially at some of those higher level classes, for example. So looking at those types of things versus cutting programming.
Thank you, I appreciate that, thanks.
And if you have anything else, any of you to add to that?
So I think what you guys are looking for tonight is some guidance from us. What do we think the community, what will be palatable to our community? So we just lost a levy, right? That was 4.9, and we had the millage in there, or the bond money in there. And we have decided, or what is being presented to us tonight is not a bond option on top of it. So I think what we need to decide as a board is what will the community support? We've made some austerity measures. We've talked about some of the cuts Angie's talked about tonight. The community is going to start to feel them. Unfortunately, we're trying our best not to impact our students and staff and make these cuts that make sense through attrition, which I deeply appreciate. So I think the conversation tonight needs to be, where do we want to go as a board? So does everyone want to take a turn? Like, what are we thinking?
I want another question for Nicole as we're talking about the amounts. So we've got a 4.9 and a 5.9 kind of projections in front of us. If we were to pass a 4.9, reasonably, when would we need to be back on the ballot?
I think we would be looking at 2028,
Okay. And with a,
depending on, again, lots of things can happen between now and then,
Yeah.
and what the state legislature does with the next biennium budget and the ones after that. But I think to me, it's the difference between revenues and expenses.
Mhm.
I think either way, we have to be back on in 2028. I think it
Okay.
is just dependent on how much does what does 2028 look like
Mhm.
if things play out as projected in this forecast.
So how close do we want to cut it?
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, I'm happy to start us off. think we should go back on the ballot, and I think we should go in May. I think, given that we just failed a levy at 4.9 and operating, we took out the bond, I think 4.9 would be a reasonable ask, although I realize, I just want to say that with looking at both of these numbers, 5.9 and 4.9, we still run at a deficit. So I think that's really important, but like our community said, this was too much, so I'm comfortable with the 4.9. I'll just leave it there.
I'm in the same place. I think, I appreciate you putting together the 4.9 and the 5.9, but with pulling the bond off, and the fact that, again, these are estimates with a 4.9, when we get to 2030, we're really close to that 90 days. Like, I'm comfortable that that's the right direction, keeping it as small as possible. I think that's as small as we can go. Yeah. But I think we need to go back on right away in May.
And I wanted to add on, I also think that we should be back on in May. And I know that we have had some individual conversations around May versus November. And if we're back on in May and we know whether we pass or not, we can start better planning for the next school year as opposed to waiting until November and hoping things work out in November. So I'm also in the boat with 4.9 for May. As you two have mentioned, the community thought that it was too much last time. So taking that bond issue out will decrease the cost to our taxpayers. And unfortunately, we're going to have to be back on the ballot probably in 2028 either way. So
I do want to point out, because I know we mentioned this previously, but we have received confirmation since the last board meeting. So just to share for the public, one of the things that was kind of up in the air previously was whether or not May would be a special election or if it would be a general. And so because the state of Ohio is definitely on the ballot, we've received confirmation for a public works project that allows us to go on, and it's not the cost of a special election. So I think that's important since you were mentioning the timing, I just wanted to point that out.
yeah.
And I am also in the camp that I think we should proceed with potentially 4.9 mil. I think with a district of our size and knowing that about 30% of our students are economically disadvantaged, it gives me some pause, knowing that there's going to be a lot of challenges down the road. But I say that to say just making sure, and I know we're really doing our best, but the more that we can really communicate with the community and be as transparent about this process, I think is something that I would like to see.
I just want to mention it's 43% economically disadvantaged.
Thank you for clarifying that. 43%.
So I agree with all of you. I think we definitely need to be on in May. I appreciate you bringing us these scenarios, Nicole. It is very interesting to look at all of them. I hope we can get them out to the public as soon as possible. 4.9, I think, is the absolute lowest we can go. And I think we need to listen to the community, and they've told us that along with the bond was too much. So I'm hoping that they can support it and support our kids.
So we need a motion, right?
Yeah, so you have a resolution in board docs.
Yep.
That doesn't have a millage amount. So if the goal is to be on the ballot in May, then someone would need to make a resolution or a motion for the resolution with the mills included.
So,
It's 10.02.
yeah. I can make a motion to.
Yeah.
I'll make a motion to approve the resolution of necessity of levy of a tax in excess of the 10 mil limitation and to submit the question of the same to the electors at a rate not to exceed 4.9 mils. Is there a second?
Second.
Who was the second?
I'm not sure who was
Me and
first.
Louise at the same time.
Yeah.
Either way.
I'll take Louis.
Take your pick.
Can you take the roll?
Yeah. Mrs. Meyer,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Levy.
Yes.
just want to, I know it's been said, but just thank you, everyone. This has been a lot of hard work going into this. I knew even over the holidays, a lot of people were working, and it's not been easy to have these conversations on any part. So just really appreciate the work that's been going into it.